started. My name is Stephanie Solom, and I'm a professor of art history here, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to the fourth of our 6 talks in the 2021 faculty lecture series. And as we traditionally remember before these lectures, that this series was founded back in 1911 by Catherine Moriarty Pratt. She was the spouse of a faculty member who wanted to, and these are her words, to relieve the tedium of long New England winters with an opportunity to hear Williams professors talk about issues that really matter to them. And so from these humble and lighthearted beginnings, the faculty lecture series has grown to become an important forum for tenured professors to share their latest research and creative work with the larger intellectual community of the college. So before we start, I wanted to say a huge thanks to some important people as ever: Veronica Bosley, Carrie Green, and Patrick Gray, who support the series and really keep it running. And also my faculty colleagues on the lecture committee, who are Siobhan Robinson and Greg Mitchell. And most especially, a warm welcome to Kate Stroud, Associate Professor of Psychology, who is so generously joining us to share her really fascinating work today. Before we begin, I wanted to be sure to tell everyone that if you have a question, a big one or a small one, please go ahead and ask Kate. I think that dialogue is such an important aspect of what we're doing here together, especially since we're not sharing space this year. So you can type questions into the Q&A box, which will be open also during the lecture and afterward, or you can raise your Zoom hand and ask a question with your live voice. And you can find that little, the Zoom hand icon under reactions on the bottom of your screen. Also, these lectures are being recorded, and you'll be able to see them, or others if people inquire, on the college's YouTube channel. They're also being televised on WillyNet. You can get their schedule on willynet.org, and you can also look after the fact under lectures and forums on their website to see the video of any of these from the series this year. And we'll put links to those places during the chat, during the lecture. Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about Kate. As I said, she's an associate professor of psychology, and she focuses her research on the origins and consequences of depression. Examining the interface between depression and social environment, Kate explores reciprocal associations between stress, interpersonal relationships, and depression in children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families. Kate completed her bachelor's degrees in French and psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is fantastic. There are very few Badgers in this area, so we need to keep together, right? And in 2009, her PhD in clinical psychology at Stony Brook University. But this was only after completing an APA-accredited predoctoral clinical psychology internship at the University of Wisconsin in their Department of Psychiatry. And subsequently, she served as a research and clinical postdoctoral fellow at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. So Kate's faculty lecture today is entitled Understanding the Interplay of Stress, Relationships, and Biology, Implications for the Development of Depression and Anxiety. Thank you so much, Kate, for being with us today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and also to the lecture committee for the opportunity to talk about my work and for organizing this series. Thanks also to Veronica Bosley, Carrie Green, and Patrick Gray for their media and technical support. So this is an important time to talk about stress, depression, and anxiety, because for many, this has been a stressful year, and that's indeed an understatement. So initial research suggests that rates of psychopathology over this past year are elevated, particularly among adolescents and young adults, with some research suggesting that a quarter and even up to a third of individuals in this age range are experiencing psychopathology. At the same time, it's also a little bit unusual to be giving a talk on a webinar rather than seeing all of your faces. Indeed, the only being at my talk, IRL, is my cat, Spica. Luckily, she's keeping me company. And the flip side, though, is that since this is on Zoom, my parents are able to attend from Wisconsin, as well as many of my former students who worked on this project. So I'm sending a special shout out to all of you, and welcome everyone. So broadly speaking, we will be talking today about the association between life stress and internalizing psychopathology, meaning anxiety and depression. And it's probably not a surprise to you that decades of research suggests that stress has profound implications for physical as well as psychological health, including internalizing psychopathology. And this is true for various types of stress, including early adversity, so early experiences during childhood, as well as more recent stressors, such as acute stressful life events and chronic stress. So given its importance, there are two key questions. One is, how does stress get under the skin to influence health? And central to this question is the allostatic load model, which posits that sustained exposure to stress alters the regulation of multiple physiological systems, and in doing so, increases risk for adverse health outcomes, including psychopathology. And more specifically, the model posits that the mechanism through which stress predicts negative health outcomes is by altering the set points regulating the activity of these systems. And most research in this area has focused on the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, one of the body's main stress response systems. And cortisol is the main hormonal output and regulator of this system. So the HPA axis is activated in the presence of a stressor, and it responds to social as well as emotional experiences, including your mood or what, even if you feel lonely. And the short term, this activation is functional. Cortisol helps provide the energy necessary to deal with a stressor on hand. However, in the long term, chronic or frequent exposure to high levels of cortisol are thought to contribute to the development of psychopathology as well as physical diseases. So a second critical question then is, what factors confer risk or protection in the face of stress? So given we all will face stressful experiences, unfortunately, during our lives, it's critical to identify factors that render individuals more vulnerable to stress, as well as those that offer protection, with the ultimate goal here of this work to inform prevention and early intervention efforts. And I will be presenting a series of studies today that address these questions using data from one of the research projects I've conducted during my time at Williams, the project on youth stress and coping. This is a 3-year longitudinal study of 132 early adolescent girls and their primary female caregivers, herein called mothers. Adolescents began the study at about 12 and a half years of age. And mothers were mostly married, and about 65% had a bachelor's degree or higher. Most families were middle to upper class, and families were predominantly white. They were recruited from Bennington and Berkshire counties. So at time one, adolescents and their mothers came to the lab. They completed separate interviews and questionnaires. They completed online questionnaires. Adolescents completed a cortisol and a genetic collection. And at time two, which occurred 1 year later, they completed phone interviews and questionnaires. And then 1 year after that, they also completed phone interviews and questionnaires. Before we talk about the results, I do want to highlight that 36 students, many for multiple semesters, worked on this project. So the bolded names are thesis students, and the names in italics are students who completed independent studies. Most students were funded by the Williams Divisional Research Funding Committee, the DRFC, so thank you, DRFC. And here are some of my former students presenting their work at national conferences, most of whom now have become clinical psychologists or gone on to medical school. So the first series of studies I'll present today investigate the mechanisms through which stress predicts the development of internalizing symptoms, focusing on the HPA axis as the potential mechanism. And importantly, this is a process that unfolds over time or across development. So mid-adolescence is a period of high risk for the development of diagnosable depression and anxiety. And so because of this, there's been increasing interest in examining the predictors of the mechanisms, the intervening variables that lie on the developmental pathway between stress and psychopathology. By identifying the predictors of the intervening variables in early adolescence, prior to this period of high risk for the development of diagnosable disorders, that can be particularly informative for prevention efforts, where the goal is to interrupt this pathway, this trajectory to internalizing psychopathology, and to do so early in that pathway. So in studies 1 and 2, I will talk to you about research that seeks to understand the relation between different types of stress and HPA axis activity. Before we talk about these studies, though, it's important to know how HPA axis activity is typically assessed. So investigators have relied on various indicators of cortisol, including basal cortisol. So this is just your level of cortisol at a particular time of day, such as morning or bedtime. Cortisol reactivity is changes in cortisol levels in response to a stressor. And diurnal cortisol is the daily pattern of cortisol secretion. So in healthy individuals, cortisol is high upon waking and then peaks within 30 to 40 minutes following waking and then reaches a nadir at bedtime. So there's robust evidence demonstrating that early adversity is associated with alterations in basal cortisol, cortisol rhythms, and cortisol reactivity, with most research focusing on childhood maltreatment, so severe abuse and neglect. And this body of work, the body of work linking recent stress and HPA axis activity is also robust, with recent acute and chronic stress, each predicting alterations in HPA axis activity. And the impact of recent stress appears to depend upon the interpersonal nature and the controllability of the stress, suggesting that the HPA axis may be particularly sensitive to interpersonal and uncontrollable threats. Despite the contribution of this work, there are significant gaps in our understanding of this link. And these links also support the allostatic load framework. So there's significant gaps in this link. So one is that less is known about the association between less severe forms of adversity and HP axis activity. So less severe, more common forms of early adversity, such as interparental conflict, parental separation, parental physical illness, despite evidence that these experiences may be also related to alterations in HP axis functioning. And second, less is known about the cumulative effect of different types of early adversity, as well as different types of recent stress. So most prior work has largely focused on understanding the impact of a single type of adversity. However, we know that these adversities, these stressors tend to occur together. And so it's important to understand their cumulative impact. So in the project on youth stress and coping, adolescents provided saliva samples to collect cortisol 3 times a day over 3 days. So once at wake up plus 30 minutes, and once at bedtime. And to collect cortisol, participants used straws like this to spit into small tubes. And the straws were kept in this track container, and we did that in order to assess compliance with the collection procedures. So the cap has a date and time stamp, which allowed us to see when participants were collecting cortisol. And at the time of each collection, adolescents provided a 2-page diary report indicating where they were, who they were with, what they were doing, thinking, and feeling. So one thing that I would like to highlight is in this study, we use gold standard semi-structured interviews to assess different types of stress. The interview is called the LSI, and it was completed separately by mothers and daughters. And what's unique about this interview is that we aim to measure stress exposure without considering participants' subjective perceptions. And we do that by using a blind coding team. So at the lab visit, we assessed recent stress using the LSI, and specifically the interview assessed the presence of stressful life events over the past year. And following the interview, narratives were created for each event, describing the surrounding context and not including participants' perceptions of the event. Each event was coded by an independent rating team who rated the degree of objective impact of the event for a typical individual given the context. Events were also rated on their degree of independence, the degree to which the event was independent of the person's behavior. So events that are outside of individuals' control are considered independent or fateful, whereas events that are at least partially the result of the adolescent's behavior were considered dependent. So for example, a death of a close other would be considered independent, unless of course you killed the person. In that case, it's dependent. So events were also coded as being either interpersonal or not. And interpersonal events were events that involved relations with others, such as conflicts or breakups, or events that affected participants' relations with others, such as their parent being incarcerated. And we used composite scores, summing the severity ratings of the events over the past year to capture the accumulation of recent acute stress. The LSI also examined chronic stress or ongoing objective stress over the past year in an array of domains. So the interpersonal domains tapped adolescents' chronic stress in their relationships with their parents, friends, peers, and romantic partners, as well as in their parents' marital or cohabiting romantic relationship, if applicable. The non-interpersonal domains tapped adolescents' chronic stress in their academic lives. And we use the mean of the domains as an indicator of the accumulation of recent chronic stress. And so similar to the procedure for coding acute stress, we also assessed early adverse experiences using the LSI. And for each adversity endorsed, narratives, which included information about the context, but not participants' subjective perceptions, were coded by an independent rating team. And the team also provided an overall objective rating, considering all of the experiences that adolescents had experienced between birth and 1 year prior to the interview. And the cortisol sampling occurred approximately 1 week after the visit. So in the studies I'll present today, we used a novel index of HP axis activity, and this is called latent trait cortisol. And this approach uses latent state trait modeling. It's basically a statistical approach that allows you to separate a latent trait factor, which captures individual differences by drawing on the commonalities among the samples, from the second factor, which is a state cortisol factor, which captures state-specific situational or environmental influences, as well as random error. And we use this approach because prior work suggested that most of the HPA indices used in prior work exhibit limited stability for periods greater than 1 month. And they largely capture moment-to-moment or day-to-day changes in HP axis functioning within individuals rather than differences between individuals. So as you can see here, the waking and waking plus 30-minute samples, but not the bedtime samples from the 3 days of collection loaded onto the LTC factor. So next we examined whether early adversity was associated with LTC. And as you can see here, greater early adversity was associated with a lower LTC level, suggesting that the accumulation of early adversity is associated with individual differences in HP axis regulation. Next, we examined whether recent stress was associated with LTC. And you'll see here that maternal education was included in the models because it was related significantly to chronic and acute stress as well as LTC. So as you can see, overall chronic stress was negatively associated with LTC, whereas overall acute stress was positively associated with LTC. And so this pattern of findings suggests that the accumulation of recent acute stress activates the HPA axis, resulting in a pattern of higher cortisol levels. In contrast, in response to chronically stressful conditions, a pattern of lower cortisol levels develops. And then next we examined whether the link between acute stress and LTC varied according to interpersonal status. And as you can see, greater interpersonal, but not non-interpersonal acute stress was associated with a higher LTC. And these pathways were significantly different from each other. And next, we examined whether the association between acute stress and LTC varied according to independence. And as you can see, greater acute independent stress, but not dependent stress, was significantly related to a higher LTC. We were excited about these findings because they fit with prior evidence suggesting that the HP axis may be particularly sensitive to interpersonal and uncontrollable threats and extend them to individual differences in HP axis activity. So one question we had was, given research indicating that early life stress may have a stronger impact on stress physiology than that occurring at later ages, we examined whether recent stress continued to be associated with LTC even after accounting for the effect of early adversity. And for acute stress, including both interpersonal and independent forms of acute stress, it continued to be significantly associated with LTC, suggesting that early adversity and recent stress each are independently related to trait-like individual differences in HP axis regulation. Surprisingly, chronic stress was no longer significantly associated with LTC after accounting for the effect of early adversity, indicating that some of the impact of recent chronic stress on LTC is due to its overlap with early adversity. So this first set of studies suggests that the accumulation of early adversity and recent stress, specifically chronic stress and interpersonal and independent forms of acute stress, are associated with trait-like individual differences in HP axis activity. And from an allostatic load perspective, this suggests that prolonged activity of the HPA axis in response to early adversity and recent stress each predict changes in the set points regulating the activity of the HP axis. And that recent stress was associated with LTC even after adjusting for the effect of early adversity, suggests that the set points regulating the HP axis continue to be shaped by the accumulation of new experiences in order to meet environmental demands, as posited by the allostatic load model. So even trait-like individual differences in HP axis regulation are not set in stone by early adversity, but continue to be shaped by our experiences, which is important because it suggests possibly that we may be able to use intervention or prevention strategies to target HPA axis regulation. So in study 3, we looked at the implications for the development of depression and anxiety. And specifically, we investigated the association between early adversity and the development of psychopathology. So unfortunately, early adversity is common. So about 60% of adolescents face early adversity. And the effect of early adversity on psychopathology is potent. So early adversity contributes to approximately 30% of all first onsets of disorders among adolescents and adults in the US population. The effect is also transdiagnostic. So rather than predicting a specific disorder, early adversity poses risk for a wide variety of psychopathologies. And in addition, the effect is cumulative. So up until a certain point, the greater severity of early adversity or the more experiences, the greater risk for the development of psychopathology. Despite this evidence, there are significant gaps. One is that few studies have evaluated the link between early adversity and psychopathology during adolescence, which is surprising given, as I mentioned before, adolescence is a period of high risk for the development of first onsets of depression and anxiety. And second, few studies have evaluated the mechanisms underlining the association between early adversity and psychopathology. So in the present study, we sought to address those gaps. And specifically, we examined whether early adversity was associated with LTC, which in turn predicted internalizing symptoms in line with the allostatic load model. And based upon the prior studies I just showed you, we predicted that lower LTC would be the mechanism through which early adversity would predict increases in internalizing symptoms. So what's new here in our procedure is that now we have data at time 2. And specifically at time 2, we used a structured clinical interview called the Kitty SADS to assess the presence of internalizing symptoms between time 1 and time 2. And in addition, we assessed internalizing symptoms at time 1. At time 1, we assessed current as well as lifetime history of symptoms. We did that because we were interested in understanding the development of internalizing symptoms over time. And so in all of our analyses, we included current and past history of symptoms. So first, we found that early adversity was indeed associated with increases in internalizing symptoms between time 1 and time 2. And then we conducted the mediation analyses. And as you can see here, early adversity was negatively associated with LTC, which in turn predicted increases in internalizing symptoms. And we conducted a number of robustness tests here. One that I'd like to mention is that we evaluated whether the findings held when we used different conceptualizations of early adversity. So specifically, we looked at whether the findings held when we looked at frequency, so the number of experiences, as well as variety, the number of different types of experiences, and the findings held when we use those conceptualizations as well. So the findings here suggest that one mechanism through which stress gets under the skin to influence risk for future internalizing psychopathology is through its association with trait-like individual differences in HPA axis functioning, consistent with the allostatic load model. So extending prior work, the present study suggested that relatively common, less severe experiences, such as exposure to marital conflict, parental illness, frequent moves, divorce, that these experiences accumulate over childhood and adolescence, and they too have the capacity to alter the functioning of the HP axis, which in turn increases risk for the later development of depression and anxiety. And you might be wondering, why lower LTC? So one possibility, and this is speculative, we hope to test this, is that consistent with the boost hypothesis, as I mentioned before, short-term elevations in cortisol are adaptive. They mobilize the body's resources to help meet perceived daily demands. And it may be that adolescents with lower LTC do not mount a cortisol response or a sufficient cortisol response when faced with stress, thereby reducing their ability to adaptively cope with such stress, which over time may contribute to the development of internalizing symptoms. And future research is needed to test this possibility, and it's something that I have in mind for the future. So in study 4, we sought to understand factors that modify the impact of stress on HP axis functioning. And so now that I've presented evidence for this pathway, I want to talk about factors that shape the association between stress and HP axis activity. And here, HP axis activity will be our outcome because, again, our ultimate goal is to interrupt this pathway and to interrupt it early. So we'll be focusing on two factors, cognitive factors as well as maternal warmth. So our focus on cognitive factors was guided first by cognitive vulnerability stress models of depression. And these models suggest that our interpretations of events shape risk for the development of depression following their occurrence. So in other words, the way we think about stressful events shape their impact on us. And myriad cognitive vulnerabilities have been identified, such as the tendency to make global attributions about the cause and consequences of events, to ruminate about the negative implications of events, and the tendency to overestimate self-blame for events. And interestingly, research and theory support links between various cognitive vulnerabilities and indices of HPA axis activity, suggesting that one potential pathway through which cognitive vulnerabilities confer risk for psychopathology is through alterations in stress physiology. Despite evidence in this area, few studies have tested the physiological consequences of cognitive interpretations of naturally occurring events, so events in adolescents' everyday lives. And no prior investigation has evaluated links between cognitive vulnerabilities and trait cortisol, leaving questions about whether cognitive vulnerabilities are related to individual differences in HPA axis activity. We also investigated whether maternal warmth moderated the physiological consequences of events. And this was guided by the social buffering model, which suggests that warm parenting may assist adolescents in regulating their physiological responses to stress. However, prior work has not examined whether warmth can moderate the impact of stress on trait cortisol, and questions remain about whether parents continue to serve as social buffers during adolescence. So I've already told you about the LSI, and we also use the LSI to measure adolescents' cognitive interpretations of events. And we focused specifically on the tendency to self-blame. And so, as you know, independence, or the adolescent's contribution to bringing about each event, was rated by an independent team who was blind to their perceptions, including whether they thought they caused the event. And in addition, we asked adolescents to provide a subjective rating of their contribution to each event's occurrence. And so to index self-blame, the objective independence rating was subtracted from adolescents' subjective rating for each event. And we aggregated this difference by event type. In order to assess maternal warmth, mothers completed the 5-minute speech sample. And here, mothers are asked to speak for 5 minutes about their child, describing what kind of person they were and how they got along with each other. And the samples were electronically recorded and later coded by a research assistant who was blind to all other data. So the research assistants coded tone of voice, enthusiasm, affection, spontaneity, interest in, and enjoyment of the adolescents in order to provide a rating of global warmth expressed specifically about the adolescent on a 1 to 5 scale. So first we examined whether early adolescent self-blame estimates were associated with LTC. And they were for independent but not other types of events. So specifically, greater self-blame estimates for independent events were associated with a lower LTC, which, as you know, is a pattern of HPA axis activity that predicts later internalizing psychopathology in this sample. So this suggests that overestimating self-blame for uncontrollable events may have particular implications for individual differences in HPA axis activity. It's also interesting because, as I'm sure you remember, when we examined whether independent acute stress was related to LTC using the team objective severity scores, the association was positive. And we talked about how perhaps that was adaptive. It mobilized the body to cope with the stressor in hand. So given that lower latent trait cortisol predicts future internalizing symptoms in this sample, this pattern of finding suggests that for independent acute stress, it's not the stress exposure, but adolescent's interpretation that confers risk for a pattern of HPA axis activity that predicts later internalizing psychopathology. So next, we examined whether maternal warmth moderated links between self-blame estimates and LTC. And warmth did not emerge as a moderator for independent events. So that means that overestimations for uncontrollable events were associated with LTC regardless of level of maternal warmth. However, warmth did emerge as a moderator for dependent events. And here are the regions of significance. So what this is showing is that for girls with greater levels of maternal warmth, so 4 or above, greater self-blame was associated with greater LTC. Conversely, for adolescents with lower levels of warmth, so 1 or 2, greater self-blame was associated with lower LTC. So these findings suggest that for dependent events, higher levels of warmth may protect adolescents from the negative physiological consequences of overestimating self-blame. Why might that be? It may be that warm parents promote the development of adaptive coping strategies, so that overestimating self-blame for dependent events, which are indeed at least in part caused by the adolescent's behavior, that may elicit warm mothers to coach their daughters to use adaptive coping strategies such as problem solving, which aim to directly alter the stressor itself or adolescent's response to the stressor. Remember that by definition, these are at least partially the result of the adolescent's behavior, and thus they may be more readily resolved by these strategies as opposed to independent events. And these strategies have been linked with effective physiological regulation in this sample using a day-to-day analysis, and they may promote physiological recovery following exposure to stress. So over time, if adolescents are adaptively coping and recovering from these events, we might expect to see an adaptive change in the set points regulating their HPA axis as reflected in higher LTC. So warmth also emerged as a moderator for interpersonal events. So among those with warmth levels of 3 or below, which was about 75% of the sample, so lower and average levels of warmth, greater self-blame was associated with lower LTC. And as you know, that's a risk factor for the development of internalizing psychopathology. So although the mechanisms underlining this effect need to be elucidated in future work, one possibility is that because the HP axis is particularly sensitive to interpersonal stress, over time, this may lead to wear and tear on the HP axis without the protective effect of high maternal warmth. And indeed, there was no effect for non-interpersonal events. So in sum, the present findings highlight the interplay of cognitive and interpersonal factors, as well as event type, in shaping the impact of stressful life events on trait cortisol during early adolescence. And that maternal warmth emerged as a moderator suggests that the HP axis remains responsive to parenting during early adolescence. This is really important because early adolescence is a developmental period characterized by increased sensitivity to the environment, increasing levels of stress, and increased risk for the development of psychopathology. And if replicated, the present findings support intervention and prevention efforts that target maternal warmth and include strategies to challenge cognitive interpretations of stressful life events with the goal of promoting adaptive HP axis functioning. So overall, the data I presented here today highlight the interplay of HP axis activity, relationships, and cognitions, as well as stress characteristics in shaping adolescents' risk for internalizing psychopathology. And the findings highlighted the importance of interpersonal relationships as both risk and protective factors. So what happens in adolescents' relationships from birth through adolescence can shape risk or offer protection in the face of stress. And importantly, we also saw that individual differences in HP axis activity continue to be shaped by the accumulation of new experiences, both the experience itself and how we think about our role in these experiences, leaving open the possibility that interventions may have the capacity to shape such differences by targeting adolescents' cognitions, parenting variables such as warmth, as well as adolescents' coping skills. And in particular, the findings also underscore the importance of tailoring these skills to specific types of stress. Doing so has the potential to interrupt the developmental trajectory to internalizing psychopathology, a possibility I'm eager to test in future work. It's also important to examine whether the present findings extend to other developmental periods, to individuals of various racial and ethnic backgrounds and other gender identities, and in a higher risk sample facing higher levels of stress. That's a project I'm working on right now, and the initial findings are replicating the results I presented today. So I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, the students who contributed to all aspects of this research project, the families who participated in this research, as well as Williams College for funding this work. Thank you as well for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have at this time.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. So interesting. A couple of questions. This is a question that I was eager to ask too, so I'm glad someone has asked about gender. Someone would like to know, please discuss your choice of mother-daughter dyads versus mother-son dyads. And I was wondering, about gender as well, and also the idea of maternal warmth. Would you just transfer that to paternal warmth if we were working with fathers and sons or fathers and daughters, or is there something kind of specific in the study about maternal warmth?
Great questions. So why did we focus on early adolescent girls? So there are a number of reasons to do so. One is that early adolescent girls are at higher risk for the development of depression as well as anxiety during adolescence in comparison to early adolescent boys. That's, of course, taking a limited gender binary approach. A second reason is that girls are more sensitive to stress, particularly interpersonal stress, and that increased sensitivity begins in early adolescence. So those were two of the reasons why I decided to focus on early adolescence. In terms of the parent, it's important to say that there were all different types of caregivers who participated in the study. So we had aunts, we had grandmothers, we had adoptive mothers, we had biological mothers. And we also did have two dads who identified themselves as primary caregivers who participated in the study. We don't have enough dads to look at whether findings varied as a function of caregiver gender identity. So there isn't anything special or particular about that. It's just that we asked people to participate with their primary caregiver, and mostly it was mothers or female caregivers who identified themselves as the primary caregiver. There is some research to suggest that there might be differences in the impact of the relationship. So again, taking a limited gender binary approach, there may be a difference between the mother-son and mother-daughter relationship, but that depends upon the outcome that you are investigating.
Okay, great. The next question is, given the importance of self-reporting in assessing the stressors experienced by the adolescents in your studies, how do you assess the truthfulness and completeness of these interview responses? I think you spoke to that a little bit, but maybe not as completely as the question is asking.
Great. So this is you're raising a good point. So this semi-structured interview, we spend about, if we take an example as an event, we spend about 5 to 7 minutes talking to the adolescent or the caregiver about the event. So in some cases, the adolescent and the caregiver report the same event. And in those cases, we actually combine their description of the event in order to create the narratives that are later coded. So it was really interesting because you would think, right, that perhaps adolescents and caregivers would have really different descriptions of events, especially certain types of events. But indeed, often there was considerable overlap. So when there was a discrepancy, we noted that there was a difference in a particular detail that was described in the event, but most often there was correspondence. So one thing that helps us to tease out that accuracy is the use of multiple reporters. A second piece, I guess, is that we really sort of got the description of the event like a news story. So we would ask a lot of questions like, oh, well, so you're saying you had a breakup. So who broke up with who? What happened first? Where did the breakup take place? Was it online? Was it on text? What were the consequences of the breakup? How long had you been together? How close you were? So we used all these details, these contextual details, to get at the severity of the event without considering adolescents' own perceptions. But you're right, we can't completely eliminate the possibility that there could be, problems with accuracy, right? They may not tell us all of the events that occurred, or of course, their story is going to be to some extent shaped by their perceptions. So this is not foolproof, but in terms of using context, that right now is the best way that we have in the field in order to get an assessment of exposure that's independent from interpretation.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about interventions. What interventions may be effective in helping to combat the adverse effects of early stress on the HPA axis to potentially rebalance it? Are there any recommendations to those who are parenting in these stressful times?
Good, good point. So there are a considerable number of studies now that have addressed exactly this question. One, I would say there's a couple types of interventions that I'd like to highlight. One is a family-based intervention in which you're targeting how mothers or caregivers help their child to cope with stress. So parents do this in a number of different ways. One way is by explicitly prompting the child to help them to cope with the stressor at hand. The second way is just by creating an environment, right, that's characterized by warmth, dependability, support. That kind of environment is going to help the child to cope with stress. So parenting interventions that aim to either help parents, coach parents in how to help their child to cope with stress, or that seek to improve the parent-child relationship, improve the overall the overall home environment. Those are interventions that have the potential to help adolescents more adaptively regulate their stress levels, physiologically speaking. The second way is through school-based interventions. So a number of school-based interventions now, particularly there's an exciting new field of research looking at mindfulness-based interventions and acceptance-based approaches. And so in these interventions, kids are taught these skills in school as a way to help them to adaptively cope with stress. And one other thing that I'd like to say is that I think the findings that I presented today show that even if you've had early stress, it's never too late, right? So your HPA axis is always responding to the environment. It's responding on a moment-to-moment basis. And so it doesn't mean that just because you had a very stressful childhood or negative things happen, because of course they will, it doesn't mean that that can't be changed, the impact on the body.
Okay, that's so interesting. In terms of the changeability of this, what about this is a little bit outside of the context of your research, but it goes back to something you said in the very beginning about just that human beings can't deal with these high levels of cortisol over time. Mm-hmm. And I'm just thinking historically and about kind of historical contingency, sort of imagining that there were times that human beings needed to be dealing with a lot of stress over long periods of time. And the idea of maternal warmth, or even kind of family warmth, is something that seems like it really is a kind of historically contingent thing. So I guess this is my question. This is kind of a dumb question. Why aren't we hardwired to do this a little bit better?
Well, Yeah, that's a great question, and it made me think about the pandemic, as a time when we're facing high levels of chronic stress sort of as a world. And certainly some people are way more affected than others. So in terms of that question, I think it's important to think about that parents are usually always doing the best that they can. And so it's usually the case that there are other factors, other contextual factors that are interfering with parents' ability to create a warm parent-child relationship or warm parent environment. And so sometimes parents are dealing with a lot of stress and chronically stressful conditions such as financial adversity or stressful neighborhoods or job related stress or marital stress, that these types of stressors can spill over into the parent child relationship or into the home environment. And that's because we get overwhelmed, right? And so it's hard to use effective coping strategies when you're under such high levels of stress. And in turn, that interferes with parents and caregivers' ability to parent or create an environment that I know all parents and all caregivers want to do. It's just that sometimes other things get in the way to make that more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Would you take there are two more questions that both have to do with maternal warmth? They're a bit interrelated.
Sounds great.
One, the first also has to kind of do with thinking a little bit historically, and this person is wondering whether maternal warmth is passed on through generations. Do kids who experience less of maternal warmth tend to express less maternal warmth when they grow up? And the other question is whether you perceive or whether you measured the perceived closeness. I should have put the emphasis on the perceived in the mother-daughter dyad. And did that moderate the relationship between adaptive coping and maternal warmth?
Great questions. So the first question about sort of the intergenerational transmission of maternal warmth, or we'll just call it caregiver warmth, is a great one. And what comes to mind is the attachment literature, which suggests that our attachment to our parents influences the type of attachment or the type of relationships that we have in adulthood. So babies and kids who tend to be securely attached to their parents tend to form secure romantic relationships, secure friendships, secure parent-child relationships in adulthood. So there is some continuity in attachment over the life course, but again, it's not something that's set in stone. And there's a concept called earned security, which comes from the attachment literature, that suggests that people can, even if they were insecurely attached early on in life to their family, that you can develop security in relationships. Sometimes it's through another close relationship, like a romantic relationship or a friendship, or a mentor relationship or a teacher relationship. Sometimes it's through therapy. And then by interrupting that link, then the idea is that you would be able to parent in a way that is associated with warmth and closeness and dependability and proximity and availability. So in a secure way. And then the second question, can you remind me what the second?
Sure. I'm sorry to ask two at a time, but this was about the measuring of perceived closeness in that mother and daughter dyad, and whether that moderated the relationship between adaptive coping and maternal warmth.
Yes, so that's a great question. We wanted to use the objective rating just so that we wouldn't have shared method bias, right? We didn't want it parents' perceptions or adolescents' perceptions, because we thought that might be related to their perceptions of the stress itself. But it is a great question. We did assess a number of different parenting variables through mother self-report. We didn't explicitly assess warmth, but we assessed things like discipline. We assessed flooding, so feeling flooded by your child. We assessed closeness, we assessed arguing. All of those were assessed by a self-report. And I haven't, to be honest, I haven't looked at whether those also moderate the relationship. I will say, though, that I did test in the 5-minute speech sample. We also assessed criticism. And to do that, we counted the number of critical or negative comments that parents made in that 5-minute speech sample. And that surprisingly did not moderate this association. I predicted that parents who had higher levels of criticism, that their daughters might also tend to overestimate self-blame because they would internalize that criticism, which is consistent with cognitive vulnerability stress models, but only maternal warmth moderated that effect, not criticism.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we close this with just the biggest thank you, Kate, for sharing your research. This is so fascinating, and we'll give a big hats off to warm caregivers everywhere, including yourself, who's caring for small people this afternoon before giving this lecture. So thank you so very much. What a difficult but hopeful thing to learn about today. So
thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Goodbye, everyone, and thanks to all our guests who came. Take care.